So I think we'll start. So it's been over 2 years since the Supreme Court decision in Navtej Singh Johar regarding Section 377 of the IPC. So have you noticed a change on the ground and any developments in the law since then?
Okay, so the Navtej Singh Johar judgment was really a culmination of almost 2 decades of organizing on the ground and legal work. And of course, it did strike down Section 377, but it also, for those 4 judgments, which 4 different judges wrote, tried to kind of explain and kind of examine what the relationship of queer people would be to the Constitution and what freedom would mean for queer persons. And I think in that, they set out a lot in terms of the explanation and how the Constitution protects each person's right to determine their own sexual orientation, their gender identity, to express that, to dress how they please, to choose the partners that they want, and live in a sort of environment which encourages them to express themselves rather than to have to hide and be ashamed of who they are. And post the judgment, from what my experience has been as a lawyer, is that many young couples from across India, spanning many different backgrounds from smaller cities, uh, have really tried to take that and have taken encouragement from the Supreme Court's judgment and escaped from abusive family situations, have declared that they would like to live with their same-sex partners. And really we see a large number of lesbian and bisexual women and transgender men, particularly because of the experience that they have in terms of the patriarchal control from their family, running away from their homes with their partners or alone to escape the control of their family, to escape being married off against their wishes, and to escape control over their lack of education, being forced to kind of stop their education. And we have now seen a series of judgments from the high courts, and that is not just Delhi and Calcutta and the bigger cities, but even from small cities, people from Gaya, from Bikaner, from Ajmer have all approached high courts in different states. It's not necessary that people have gone to high courts within the same states, but we've now seen judgments from Delhi, Calcutta, Orissa, um, Gujarat, and now finally in this emphatic Madras High Court judgment. And really, the reiteration is that you have a right to life, a right to choose your partner without being attacked by your family. And I think that is something which is very encouraging on the one hand, because you can see young people escaping and to safety and using the institutions and using the constitution to be able to assert their rights and assert themselves. But at the same time, it gives us an idea of the scale of the problem, because really only a fraction of the cases get to the courts and get through the police stations. And then the other thing which is worrying is that clearly the institutions are not functioning the way that they should, in as much as the police is not being supportive. The police needs the high court intervention. It needs lawyers to force them to do their job. And really what the police continues to do is to put pressure on young individuals to obey their families. So they continue to act as a tool of patriarchal oppression and violate the rights of queer people. So post Navtej, you can see a lot of movement on the ground, and really lesbian women, bisexual women, and transgender men taking the lead in sort of asserting their rights and going to court. So that's been a sort of mixed experience.
Okay, and so like focusing on the educational field in particular, we often like come across cases of discrimination, bullying, or just hate speech faced by the community in educational institutions on a daily basis. And there remain many people who are not aware of provisions that exist to protect the community. So could you talk about some provisions that can be availed in this case of discrimination, that if discrimination is occurring in educational institutions?
Okay. So I think that's a very important question, and really, I think I would answer it at two different levels. The first is, of course, the way that educational institutions, and here I'm talking about um, colleges and institutions of higher education, relate to their queer students. And the discrimination spans many sort of areas. It can be from actively hostile in terms of the administration refusing to recognize queer people. So there would be a refusal both from the administration and professors in terms of recognizing the self-identified gender of somebody, uh, recognizing their chosen name is different from the name on their paperwork and their documentation, misgendering them deliberately, um, shaming them for wearing clothes which don't really fit with their formal gender on the records of the college. So if you identify, say, as a male, but your paperwork shows you to be female for the college authorities very often shame the person for looking too masculine or presenting too masculine, for cutting their hair short, uh, allowing then for a sort of institutional hostility to the person accessing the classroom, accessing education, and really being able to engage with the institution. So that's one sort of set where the hostility is very high. And the other set is sort of where there's just a general failure to engage with LGBT issues and recognize them as important, really under the garb of neutrality and academic freedom. And so I would say, for example, in National Law University Jodhpur, a single professor of sociology recently had put a lot of material out from anti-LGBT groups about how same-sex marriage might impact the family, right? It's something that is being argued in the High Court now, but it's the material she put out. So when this was flagged by the students, the pushback from the administration was not that no, of course, LGBT rights are not important. That was something that was acknowledged as a given. But the pushback was there is academic freedom to the professor to decide. And the professor was like, I will not take a particular view, but I will give you like both sides of the issue, what the viewpoint is in more conservative sides. And so that really becomes sort of a veil to push anti-LGBT issues. So if you are a young queer person who's struggled through school, which we know is a very difficult part to kind of navigate as a young queer individual, you're now in college and you're discussing rights. You're in a premier law school, engaging with the constitution, engaging with rights, but you're being sort of forced to say, no, look, there's another side to LGBT rights, that uh, there could be the destruction of the family if you assert the right to marry. So what does that communicate to young people? So that's really homophobia, but being defended under the garb of institutional academic freedom. I'm not saying that you can't have any material, you can study it, but that material has to be dealt with very carefully. And that wasn't happening here. So that is a big problem. So I think institutionally there's a major issue of recognition and engagement with queer people in the way that they identify. And that really causes people to stop going to class, to drop out of their college education. So many trans men, um, because they have not been recognized as trans men, stop going to class because it's just an everyday battle of being recognized as a man. So some of the people who've spoken to us and asked for redress in terms of the law have really said that to have to prove your masculinity on an everyday basis just becomes an unending battle. So why should they continue to go to that institution which is so hostile to them uh, that there's no way they can start to learn because they're just dealing with this hostility itself? That apart, there are, of course, when you go to college, you come into contact with people from across the country. And some of them may have met trans people, may have met people from the community, gay and lesbian person, and some of them may not have. And so you may be the first person that they are interacting with. They may not recognize you in your gender identity. They may shame you for your sexual orientation. And I think it's important on the institution to bring up these issues and sensitize people. But at least there is some regulation on this, because the UGC guidelines on ragging from 2016 have been amended. And so the ragging guidelines kind of protect abuse on sexual orientation and gender identity, in addition to ragging on other issues. So at least in that case, there's some remedy there. You can approach the anti-ragging committee, etc., and there can be consequences to other students committing acts of ragging. Apart from that, the new Transgender Act also brings in obligations for educational institutions. Of course, there are many problems with the Act, very major fundamental problems, which we will be discussing. But the transgender rules, which have come in 2020, in September 2020, they have required each institution to create an anti-discrimination cell for transgender persons. So that's very useful. That's also taken things ahead. So I'm hoping that as things progress, there will be less silence on these issues. But to hold the institutions to account is a big battle. Because I noticed, for example, with BITS Pilani, there is reference to the 2009 anti-ragging regulations, but they don't reflect the 2016 amendments. So, even though you might be engaged on an issue, you still may not be actively protecting your LGBT students.
So, speaking of young queer people, another rising issue seems to be conversion therapy. So, I was wondering, when it comes to conversion therapy, are there any steps that can be taken to help someone who might be being forced to undergo conversion therapy, or even to help yourself?
Okay. So, as most people listening will know, conversion therapy is basically a series of steps that doctors and particularly people who practice mental health related interventions. I put doctors in quotes because there are many quacks out there. Uh, and they use different techniques to change your sexual orientation or your gender identity to bring it in line with normative practices. Sorry, with norms. And that could mean giving hormones, say, for example, giving testosterone to somebody they don't perceive to be masculine enough, to other kind of barbaric things like shock therapy, um, showing images, using sort of withdrawal of pleasure, etc. And some of it can actually be in very barbaric institutional settings where you may be held against your will. And really, at its core, it tries to strip you down as a person and shame you for who you are, and basically saying that you have to change. So the impact is actually very long lasting and can be very so severe that people, as you may have seen recently, young people have even taken their life post conversion therapy. Uh, so it is a very serious issue. And it's very common for the first reaction of families when they come to know about their children being queer is to want to take them to doctors or psychiatrists or therapists, etc. Now, since 2017, since the time the Mental Health Care Act was passed, conversion therapy is entirely illegal. The Mental Health Care Act basically says that to consider something an illness, it must be it must be decided by national and international norms. Now, international norms have been clear for a very long time. Both the American Psychological Association and the WHO, the two sort of diagnostic tools that we have to determine what's a mental illness and not. Of course, they're problematic in their own rights. Have been very clear that alternate sexualities and being trans are not mental illnesses, as straightforward as that. Yet the practice on the ground, and it's so common, is that people will continue to treat them as such. The Mental Health Care Act also says that as a mental health professional, persons can't do something which their field doesn't authorize them to do. And if they do that, it's a crime. So there is an offense. So if someone's being forced to go undergo conversion therapy with a psychiatrist or a doctor, you can actually file a criminal case against them under the Mental Health Act. I think the problem really is that if one is dragged to somebody who's totally unregistered, right? So there's no professional consequences. You couldn't file a negligence case against them. And they're entirely sort of operating in a vacuum of law and ethical regulations. What do you do? And in that case, you have to kind of reach out and we will figure out whether to file a criminal case of cheating, of assault, of battery, and things like that. But certainly one can do things. It's not that there's no remedy. And the other thing is that one really has to try to reach out to somebody who can support you because you're so stripped down in terms of your own relationship with yourself and how you kind of relate to your sexual orientation or gender identity. And maybe you need help getting out of an institution where your family has forced you to be in there. And this experience has been, for example, in drug de-addiction centers where many times families have kind of forced their family members in, and there was very little regulation at the time. So we've had to approach courts to kind of get people to be released from this kind of illegal detention. So there are certainly things one can do, and the Mental Health Act is primarily the tool that can be used. And if you see the recent Madras High Court judgment, it's kind of emphasized the fact that the Indian Medical Council, the Indian Psychiatric Association, and the other authorities must take steps to ensure that conversion therapy is not taking place. So that's very important. The fact that the Madras High Court has now re-emphasized what is in the Mental Health Act, it was in Navteej Singh Johar, and now it's being re-emphasized recently by the Madras High Court. Before you proceed, there's an interesting question in the chat, which is basically about what if the person themselves is interested in conversion therapy? And I think that's an important question because it has come up a lot. And it's very much dealt with in the medical literature. And it basically, the advice is that the person concerned, as in the therapist or the psychiatrist, is supposed to support that person in a non-judgmental way and then encourage them to kind of gain acceptance, but not allow them to take the route of forcing themselves into kind of harmful medical procedures, which would be really detrimental to their long-term health.
So coming to the Transgender Person Act and the criticism the criticism surrounding it, could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the Transgender Person Act comes to be passed in 2019 after a sort of very contentious process where the community, the trans community, was really up in arms. And despite the vehement protests and the criticisms, the parliament, passed the law, but really it was pushed through by the government despite all the protests and despite all the criticism. And at its center, the most problematic part is really the way that it institutes a procedure for recognition, which is unconstitutional in my opinion. But basically, a trans person has to approach the district magistrate where they're living through an affidavit and an application form, then be recognized as transgender, quote unquote, irrespective of whether they identify as male, female, or in another category. Once they go through that process, this is the sort of first step of the recognition process, they then have to get surgery as per the Act and then apply again to the district magistrate for the second time, now to be recognized as male or female. This is if the person identifies as male or female. So what are the problems with that? One is the Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court in Nalsa, is very clear that each person has the right to decide their own gender identity. It doesn't have to be dependent on a process where you kind of apply to a magistrate who does a sort of fact-finding inquiry. It might be summary, it might be quick, but an application also kind of presumes that it could be rejected, right? And who is a magistrate to reject how an individual identifies, how an individual feels their gender is appropriately experienced by them? The magistrate has no ability to do that. Second, it requires medical intervention, right? That's something specifically uh, prohibited by the Supreme Court in Nalsa. We had arguments on it. We showed the Supreme Court at that time in 2013 that Argentina, for example, had a specific act which did not require medical intervention. And that's something the Supreme Court took on board and it made part of its declarations. Despite that, the act now says that you must get surgery. Now, the transgender rules, which have come in after the act, the next year, they actually reduce the requirement of surgery, thankfully. So, before the second step, instead of surgery, they have now changed that to medical intervention. So, even if a trans person gets counseling or some part of their surgery done, that would be sufficient to get their documents changed to male or female as they identify. So, really, what this act has done has created an insurmountable burden to be recognized. And what it does is actually pushes trans people into a place where they have to prove themselves, have to change their bodies in accordance with medical ideas of what a man or what a woman should look like, should present as, should be like. So that depathologization of trans identities is sort of now inbuilt into the law, and it really slows down an individual's life. So I have many trans clients right now who are trying to get jobs, but their documents cannot be changed till they finish this process before the district magistrate, one step or two steps depending on how they identify, and they then till then are not able to get a job where the employer relates to them in their self-perceived gender identity. So many people would then prefer to stay at home rather than be misgendered and face abuse and harassment in their employment, because they may present as a man but their papers say they are female, and so then the HR of their job treats them as a female, misgenders them. Their email address is in their legal name but not in their chosen name. You know, they may have to use a male locker room, for example. They may have to use a male bathroom. And so that hurdle that the Transgender Act creates is extremely problematic because it's something so personal to a person, their gender. It takes that personal decision and puts it into the administrative process. You now must go to the magistrate. The magistrate will visit your home to see whether you're living there or not. You then must go to the medical establishments, get paperwork from there, then come back to the magistrate and then establish yourself again. So there are now, of course, a number of petitions against the Act in the Supreme Court. They haven't been taken up yet, but we're hoping that they will be taken up and decided soon.
Related to that, the continuous postponement of the hearing of cases seeking the recognition of same-sex marriage, and the various remarks made by the government about the matter not being urgent. What do you think about that? Because, like, do you have any thoughts on that?
So I think that's the delays are one part. I'll come to the delays, but I think what's very interesting is the affidavit that has been filed by the union government. And really, that affidavit is an exercise in homophobia and transphobia personified. It is a reminder of how the Home Ministry in 2004, if I'm not mistaken, filed its response to the Section 377 petition. And so, what the government is arguing in the same sex marriage case is that there is an Indian family unit. What that unit is, of course, is not defined by them, but we kind of get the implication. It is basically man, woman, child, maybe the extended family, etc. But it is not same sex individuals and it is not trans individuals. They painfully repeat the word biological man and biological woman throughout. So that biological determinism, the transphobia is writ large there. Now, just please remember that already trans people have been recognized for the purposes of marriage in the Arun Kumar judgment by the Madras High Court. So, the Madras High Court said that trans woman is a woman for the purposes of marriage. There are many trans individuals who have got married already. They are within sort of the framework of man-woman. So, one individual may be, say, a trans man, their partner may be a cis woman, and they have gotten married. So this affidavit is very anti-trans persons entering the institution of marriage as trans individuals. That's the first thing. The second thing is that they say that family law is a matter of religion and morals, and the Indian society and its morals do not recognize same-sex marriage, and it's not something for the court to go on. So basically, all of us in the queer community are not Indian. This is a Western construct. It's the same nonsense that has been spewed throughout the 377 case, that this is a Western agenda. That Parliament has passed the Transgender Persons Act, now of course is lost on this government and its thing. I mean, it's the same government which passed it, but it's not reflected in the affidavit. That's the first thing. The second thing is that they now rely on Navtej to say that marriage is not a fundamental right for same-sex individuals. Why? Because Navtej is talking about the right to unions. So the question of same-sex marriage was not before the Supreme Court in Navtej Singh Johar. It is the criminalization of sexual conduct and its reflective sort of criminalization on individuals expressing that conduct. In discussing that judgment, in discussing that legal issue, the Supreme Court is very clear and really lays the framework of recognizing the union between same-sex individuals. That actually you can form relationships, you can express yourself through your relationships and individually, you can go out in public, you can be who you are, and you don't have to hide. They have basically taken the language, because the Supreme Court was not dealing with marriage and it made clear that it was not dealing with marriage, tried to take that and also now rely on Navtej and use it against these current petitions. Which I thought is very interesting, because they are relying on a judgment which is now squarely against them and really laid the foundation for same-sex marriage to take place. And I think that the fact that the government has gone so far into saying that the Indian sort of ethos does not allow LGBT couples and does not allow anything other than a biological male and a biological female really shows its homophobia and transphobia. And that you can see in the way that it's trying to delay the case. Right? So the fact that it's delaying the case, saying that no, COVID is very important, we're very busy, people are sick. It's not actually that they're worried about COVID or they're slowed down by COVID. It is that they don't want this case to be heard and they don't want to permit this. So it is a big battle ahead. It's something that will not be easy with this government opposing it tooth and nail. But I think the Constitution is on our side, and the Supreme Court's interpretation in Navtej Singh Johar and the Madras High Court judgment in Arun Kumar and the recent High Court judgment from the Madras High Court about not harassing LGBT couples and leaving them if they state that they are living with each other of their own will, that the criminal cases should stop. That should all add together to actually build momentum to bring this case to a close in our favor.
Okay, and I think there was a question in the chat before. Let me find it. So about the BITS guidelines, like, is there anything we as students can do that could even just like help the community a little, as allies, as members?
About the BITS guidelines? Yes, of course, you can definitely demand from your institution that the BITS guidelines be amended to reflect the UGC guidelines. The UGC guidelines are binding on a deemed university, which BITS is. So there's no doubt that gender and sexual orientation must become recognized as prohibited grounds of harassment. So you can't harass anybody on sexual orientation and gender. That's one. You can use the observations in the Madras High Court judgment about sensitizing educational institutions and amending its framework and conducting trainings to kind of ask the administration to start discussing these issues and sensitizing the staff, the students, and the faculty. And you can also use the provisions in the transgender rule which require a anti-discrimination cell for trans people. So I think those three things are open for you immediately.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions. If anyone has questions, they can. Okay, I think someone's asked something. The video.
Okay, so I can say a question about what the BITS guidelines are. The BITS guidelines are basically what I was mentioning was that there are anti-ragging guidelines of BITS Pilani in each institution, but they're based on what the UGC requires. The UGC guidelines have been amended in 2016 to recognize ragging on the basis of a person's gender and their sexual orientation. So both are prohibited. Any ragging on the basis of sexual orientation or gender are prohibited, and complaints can be made to the anti-ragging committee. So I was just saying that based on my reading from the website of BITS Pilani, that those guidelines have not been amended to reflect the 2016 amendments, and so the BITS guidelines have to be updated to ensure the protection of the queer community on campus.
There's another question. When do you think same-sex marriage will be legalized?
When do I think? Oh, that's a good question. Well, the 377 case, for example, was filed in 2001, and the first judgment in the High Court came in 2009. So that was 9 years. Eventually, that was appealed, and the 2018 judgment is really what brought that to a close. So that was really 17, 18 years of litigation. I think in the High Court, it's safe to assume that cases take between 2 to 4 years at least. One never knows. Sometimes they go faster, sometimes they go slower. From what I can make out, the government is really trying to delay this, as I said, to bring up all sorts of excuses not to have the case proceed. And really, it's its own homophobia and transphobia that it's showing at each hearing, where it's trying to stop the hearings of the cases. So with the government dragging its feet, it could take a little bit longer, but it really depends on the court. At some point, it may just decide that this matter needs to be decided quickly, and we may have a judgment. But the Indian judicial system is very overburdened, so I can't guarantee you, and I can't predict something with certainty.
There's another question. What changes would, about same-sex marriage, what changes would that actually bring in the sense, in terms of insurance, and are there any problems that would come with it?
Well, same-sex marriages would bring a lot of change, and it would also not change something. So before I get into insurance, let's just first say same-sex marriage is an institution which gives somebody a status. So towards the world, you and your partner are married, and many legal consequences flow from that, including, for example, being emergency contacts in medical systems, to protection in terms of evidence of the communication between the two of you, and also just the dignity of your relationship being recognized on par with everybody else. Now, a lot of the people that I work with actually want to enter into marriage as a defense against their family, right? Because they are leaving and their families are attacking them. And to them, they feel like this is going to be some kind of protection. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't necessarily agree, because, when we are in court, there are many interfaith and intercaste couples also asking for protection. So it's not that simply you enter into the institution of marriage and suddenly society backs off and says, yes, 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 you're fine. We don't judge you. We are not going to look at our honor in terms of caste, in terms of choice, in terms of the stigma of being in a same-sex relationship. So that's one thing in terms of safety. It's no guarantee. We need a lot of other things to go along with it to enable people to enter into relationships and express their uh, desire in terms of those romantic relationships. The other thing is, we are told that marriage is an institution of love, right? So you should enter it when your relationship reaches that sort of stage where you think, okay, this is permanent. But if you're now entering it into it when you think, okay, this is my defense, it really changes the nature of what marriage is. Because now suddenly it's not an institution of love, but it's an institution of please leave us alone. Like parents get off my back, police get off my back, state get off my back. And so one has to question is, do we need marriage for that? Why can we not as adults make those choices without having to enter into a marriage and then get that protection and enter into marriage later if one decides to or if one doesn't? Now, in terms of insurance, of course, there are many difficult issues of being recognized with one's partner. You can do it because insurance is a contract, so you could nominate each other and things like that. But it is a battle. It's a battle with insurance companies. There's a lot of ongoing negotiation. Many people have approached us, even for bank accounts, for example, to have joint bank accounts, and they're like, "Who is this friends and what is this relationship?" There's no quote unquote legitimacy in many formal institutions till you're married. So that is maybe some of the things that marriage will sort out. What are the problems that it will bring? As a lawyer, I can tell you divorce is a nightmare. Being in court is a nightmare for divorce. So if you get married, you're in a very formal relationship, very formal institution. And so then getting out of it is a very complicated process. It's a difficult process. If it's not amicable, it's even more difficult. Divorce cases can take many years, 10 years. There are multiple cases if there are children involved, there are assets involved. And really, that's not something we should be looking forward to as a community. But I think divorce law reform should be along with our demands for marriage, because actually, I think the state very clearly disincentivizes divorce. Because to them, really keeping people in a marriage, and if they don't want to, is something that it seems to be a state objective. That's one. I also want to say that there are many queer people who are already in the institution of marriage, not of their own wish, but there are many queer women who've been forced into marriage with men. There are many trans men who've been forced into marriage with men. And they are trying to get out of that institution. And it's not easy to get out. To now start to demand that you can't stay in that marriage, the question is why? So traditionally, you have to establish cruelty, for example. You have to establish desertion. You have to establish that your spouse had sexual relationships outside the marriage. And maybe as a queer individual, you were not interested in your spouse. You were not able to engage with them. You were not able to have a sexual relationship with them. So you can't establish all those traditional grounds of cruelty, but your spouse might have a lot of problems with you. And because actually you were forced into that marriage. So that raises a very complicated legal issue where we really try to find what can we argue to get out of such marriages. And all sorts of allegations have come against queer people that they were fraudulently, they knew about their orientation when they entered into the marriage, whether they did or they didn't. Their family committed a fraud by not disclosing their sexual orientation, despite the fact that that person may not have even willingly gone into the marriage. In one case where a trans man has been married, and this case is ongoing, the family is now saying that that person is not a man, and that actually this was a same-sex marriage, and therefore it's no validity whatsoever, despite the fact that he is a man. So now the battle has moved in a sense to the family court, where again, say for example, trans persons have to prove their manliness or femininity, depending on the case. And also, queer people have to face all these allegations of fraud, deception, and cruelty on their part. So, because of its history, I mean, the institution of marriage has many complications, definitely in terms of getting out of it.
So, if same sex marriage gets legalized, can anyone petition against it and bring it back to its old status?
Well, if same-sex marriage gets legalized, it would be through a declaration of the High Court. If this current process is taken to its logical conclusion and the cases are won, right? So basically, the court will say the Constitution requires same-sex marriage to be recognized, and the fact that the Special Marriage Act does not recognize same-sex marriage is discrimination, is a violation of the right to privacy, autonomy, dignity, etc. So that reading, that declaration would become part of the Constitution, and that reading of the Act would apply to the way the Act is enforced. Now, what happens if it's opposed? Now, it won't be opposed on a case-to-case basis, but there will be opposition to the judgment, for example. So, post the victory in the 377 case, we saw all the religious groups across religions really unite and file appeals in the Supreme Court. Right? So, immediately after the NAS Foundation judgment in 2009, the Supreme Court saw a range of religious-based petitions against the judgment. And I think that might happen as well here. So you can expect opposition, not just from the government like we're seeing right now, but from religious groups who feel like marriage should be an institution that they have the prerogative of determining who enters and who doesn't. So, of course, the way the government is arguing is that marriage is very much linked to religion, but they have not answered the question about the Special Marriage Act, the secular institution, the creation of the statute where you can get married irrespective of your religion.
So we'll take one last question from the
Sure.
chat. Someone is asking for recommended resources where allies can educate themselves or respond to any calls for action that the movement might set up.
I don't have a list ready on me now, but I think that's certainly something that we can put together and put out, maybe through your page or other groups which are active.
Even though 377 is decriminalized, people are able to get away with giving threats. What can be done in this regard, and what are the protection laws for the community?
Do you mean threats in terms of blackmail? Is that sort of what the question is?
Yeah, there was a paragraph before that about a news article where a few men were blackmailed.
Okay.
By a guy they met through a dating app.
Right. So blackmail and violence, theft, etc., is very common amongst the community. Particularly, it happens with men. I mean, by and large, that seems to have been the complaints that we receive. And when 377 was there, it was very tricky. So basically, the way it goes is that you may meet somebody for a hookup or for a date. Sometimes it's in public, sometimes it's in your room or in wherever you're living. The person and you may or may not have sex, but immediately then a scene is created where you're blackmailed either with a case of 377 against you, or more commonly that you will be outed. You'll be outed to your parents, you'll be outed to your workplace, you'll be outed to your landlord. And then persons are really vulnerable because then at that point there are very hostile, aggressive people in their room threatening them and blackmailing them. And many people have been taken to the ATM to empty their bank accounts. Sometimes blackmailers will keep their phones and contact them repeatedly and take huge sums of money. And 377 really prohibited people from making these complaints, because if you made a complaint, the police would get very interested in your sexual activity. And it could have been that you may have had an act of oral sex or anal sex, which then meant that you could potentially be prosecuted for 377. So despite the fact that you were a victim for a crime, when you went to complain about it, you might have been prosecuted for another crime. Now that 377 has gone, the legal barrier is gone. So you can definitely go and make a complaint of extortion under 388, 389. The punishment is very strong. Some people have done it. I have cases where I'm helping people who have filed FIRs of theft and extortion. But I think the issue is actually more complicated because the people who are committing these crimes, the crimes of extortion, are preying on people very specifically. They find people who are not out, who may not have social support, who may not be able to reach out for help in an emergency, right? And so those things actually, which make them vulnerable to these crimes, also prevent them from going to the police, for example, or reaching out to an activist, or say calling up friends and saying, come here, I am being harassed by these goons, because they are still in the closet and have not actually told maybe their friends, or have not been to any, say, community events, or know a lawyer who might come and help them. So the fact is, this is still a big problem because of the way that the crime works and the way that the criminals are targeting people. So I still see it happening very regularly. I'm hoping that as the discussions happen more and we talk to people more about it and be prepared about digital safety and about navigating the apps particularly, because the apps give you no warning that this is happening, right? So suddenly you may have called somebody and you're ready for a hookup, but you may have three guys at the door going through your stuff, screaming and shouting. It's just a nightmare to deal with. So the more you're prepared, the more precautions you take. That is one thing. And the thing is that the experience has been that if you go to the police are very hostile on these cases, and they're just like very interested in Grinder. I've had people call to the police station, made to open Grinder, show the police officers what's happening, what do you meet, why do you meet, what is all the discussion about. Very voyeuristic, not with the aim of finding anything out, but just to harass, just to know. Um, and those practices have been very difficult. It's a big deterrent for people to report the crime. So actually, people need support to report these crimes, and we try to give it as much as possible if we're contacted. But it's not always that we are contacted and people are available to go support them.
Live here. Thank you so much. I think we all learned a lot, especially about the BITS guidelines. And yeah,
Thank you so
so
much
I'll
for
end the
having me.
live here.